It's obviously, as for anyone, it's a challenge to find the right person. But when you add a disability, I think there's that extra pressure. Hi, my name's Charlie Randell. I run a personal brand called Not Quite Politically Correct, focusing on breaking down stereotypes around disability in a fun and friendly way. And I'm here today answering all of your questions in and around disability. What was education like with cerebral palsy? Education was a bit of a mixed bag for me. I'd say in primary school, brilliant thing with young kids is they don't know stereotypes and they just sort of throw themselves into stuff. In primary school, I had a really good experience of being sort of included in everything. It helped that I went to a mainstream primary school with additional support there for people with disabilities. Then going on to secondary school, I think the big challenge for me, as for anyone, is sort of finding your social group. I always say when answering this question, my biggest mistake was doing the classic thing of trying to get into the popular group. It just sent me down a sort of negative path in terms of the thoughts I had about myself. As I got older, I found sort of my group, if you like, where I could be completely myself and didn't have to watch out for what I said or how I was. In terms of education, I had a fairly average education in terms of I did okay school, I didn't do fantastic, but here I am today, I guess. What are some aspects of my life that people without a disability might not be aware of? This one's a bit of a difficult one because there's many different things. One thing I would say is that getting dressed is a challenge for me, so I've had to figure out different ways of getting myself dressed. So I actually use a litter picker to dress my bottom half. I'm also unable to, I can take my own shoes off, I can't put them on, so I need additional support with that, which is a bit of a nightmare, especially when everyone leaves the house and just leaves you to it. But in terms of what else I need support with, so I often get muscle spasms, which are extremely painful and can occur sort of any time, particularly during the night, which can affect sort of my sleep and then affect the rest of my day following that as well. My ability to earn, getting into work was really hard for me because at the time, obviously pre-COVID, working from home wasn't really a thing. Getting into work where it was accessible, the building was accessible, was really challenging. Obviously now, that's not so much of a barrier because companies are now a lot more open to the idea, but when I originally left school, being an 18-year-old trying to get into work, they almost had the mentality of they didn't trust me enough to be able to work from home. Also, another thing that's affected is my ability to move out and live independently. I currently still live with my parents, but it's something that I'm always considering because I've got to consider, okay, I want to buy a house, but I can't keep affording to adapt properties and making sure that they're accessible to me. Do you find that people get uncomfortable when talking to you about your disability? Definitely. This is actually why I set up my personal brand, because I wanted it to be a fun and friendly conversation. I'm the first person to make a joke out of my disability, and I often use that skill as an icebreaker when meeting a new individual because it shows them that I am comfortable around this topic, and that often opens up the conversation to allow them to ask me more questions. A difficult thing in terms of society, because there's a society where they don't want to offend anyone and they're always questioning what they say, whereas I'd much rather, if you've got a question, you come at me and ask me it rather than sit there and stare at me. So it's definitely something that I experience, but it's something that I'm trying to tackle, and I think we are making steps in the right direction. What do I think about the medical model versus the social model in terms of making my life easier? I think this is a difficult question because I think there's benefits to both. Particularly, I think that a diagnosis can help an individual with developing their identity and understanding of their condition. There is a certain point in terms of, for me personally, I guess the medical model would say go and do more physio, go and do more stretching, try and learn to walk, try and essentially find a way of doing it. There's a limitation of which how far that can go, because my disability isn't going to up and leave. That wiring of my brain is never going to change. Why can't society give me that additional support to then bridge the gap? One common thing that we always think, I always think with my friends, is why is it that in society steps are always used when actually an able-bodied person is fully able to walk up a ramp, if anything, is slightly easier, and then it's access for all. So this has an impact on what employment I go for. So I live just outside London. The main reason I didn't choose to work in London is because of the difficulties I face with travelling. it doesn't negatively affect an able-bodied person if they don't have to step up onto the train, but it negatively affects a disabled person because there's that additional barrier. So I just think, why can't design and society just be more inclusive in terms of the way they think? A lot of the time when you consider what support disabled individuals need, it would benefit both parties. Like one thing maybe to point out is that if there is more ramps and stuff available for physically disabled, that helps elderly, that helps people with children, it helps everyone. It needs to be viewed of how can we help everyone instead of how can we just help disabled people. By making society more accessible to everyone, it's going to help everyone in the long term, because the disabled individual is going to be able to achieve more, which means that they're more valuable to society because they're able to support with things that they maybe can't do at the moment because society doesn't allow them to. How does my disability affect intimacy and relationships? It's obviously, as for anyone, it's a challenge to find the right person, but when you add a disability, I think there's that extra pressure, because you are more likely, unfortunately, to get knockbacks from people because they're not exposed to disability, so they don't know how to react to it and how to sort of work around it. So it's trying to find that individual that's open to the idea. Obviously, in addition to that, a lot of people with disabilities have struggles with mental health in terms of self-confidence. So that's another element that's brought in. It's almost the cliche of you've got to love yourself before you can get to that point. I was very lucky that I've been in a long-term relationship now for nearly 5 years. It's now not really a question. It's extremely comfortable, and I think it's just finding that individual that you can really connect with and that can understand your disability but also see you as you. In terms of intimacy, for anyone, you've just got to go with the flow and see what happens. Luckily, when we have had awkward occasions, we've just sort of laughed about it and sort of moved on. It hasn't ruined the mood, if you like. I think the thing is as well, it gets overthought because everyone has that issue. Everyone has different things that they're not confident about or different struggles. So it's just being aware that we are no different. There might just be certain things that we need to consider a little bit more. Do I believe that people with visible disabilities are treated differently to those with invisible disabilities within the disabled community? It's a really difficult question to answer because obviously a visible disability, there are stigmas that come along with that. Because invisible disabilities aren't visible, they are often not spoken about as much. I certainly have fallen into the trap of not thinking someone's got a disability and then finding out later on that they have. For example, I've challenged an individual that stepped out of a disabled toilet thinking that they were just an able-bodied person, and it turned out that they have that invisible disabilities. There maybe is even an us and them culture within that sector because it's not spoken about a lot. There's a lack of awareness, but then there are definitely improvements that have happened over recent years that have sort of helped to bridge that gap and show that we need to tackle this together as opposed to separate. But I do think that maybe they do face more challenges than those with visible disabilities because they're almost having to fight to show that they have a condition, whereas you walk up to me, I'm in a wheelchair, you know straight off the bat that I have a disability. So I think it's almost they have to do so much more explaining than maybe the people with visible disabilities have to do. What day-to-day challenges do I face? Day-to-day challenges for me, kind of difficult to sort of pinpoint because obviously for me they're normal and have come to a point where they're not challenges because I've become so used to it. Obviously, as I've mentioned, putting shoes on is a challenge for me, and that's something that I have to deal with every day, and actually that probably causes me more issues than people think because you are dependent on another individual. In terms of other challenges, things like fatigue are extremely challenging for me. I'm quite heavily into the gym, so I'm always in the gym, but because of that, I can often find things like getting my equipment into the car after a hard session or after a hard day can be a challenge. So it's then having to deal with that mental block of, right, okay, you've got to do this because otherwise you're stuck. The other challenges I have are often around access. So for example, if I'm going to a bar or a restaurant or a new office, I have to constantly consider, is this place accessible? Do they have accessible parking? Do they have an accessible toilet? How far away is the car park from the location I need to be, how long is that going to take me. I'm a bit of a plan freak, and I think that stemmed from having my disability, because I have to know what's going on. By nature, I'm quite spontaneous, but my disability means that I have to be so planned and so precise. Accessibility is probably one of the main struggles that I face day to day. How do people's perceptions of me affect me? This one's a really difficult one to answer, because I'm very lucky that I've got to a point in my life where I kind of brush it off, and I've got to a point where it doesn't affect me as much as it used to. But obviously everyone has good and bad days. People's perceptions of disability is often that they're all the same. So for example, I commonly get mistaken for someone who has a learning difficulty or those sort of challenges, whereas actually my challenges are all physical, because that's what people have been exposed to. That's what they assume everyone has. People judge you before actually getting to know you. A lot of the time I've had people have one perception of me when they first initially met me, but then realise I'm not too dissimilar to them, which is probably one of my favourite things to sort of watch happen, because you see the cogs turn in people's heads and go, actually, like, he's no different to what I am, he just has to do these different tasks slightly differently. A common misconception with intimacy and relationships that also links in with this, people often think that within a interabled or a relationship where there is a disabled person and an able-bodied person, that the able-bodied person is a caregiver, which is another thing that affects me day to day, because it's often like you're seen as like a booby prize, or like you're less than the other person. So that's a common misconception that me in a relationship has to deal with every day. That's the way society sees it. Like, it's almost a shock when people find out I'm in a average relationship, because how can that be? Because you've got a disability, if that makes sense. Have I faced any stigma or judgment from anyone at the gym when training? Yes and no. I have to say I don't think I've faced any negative stigma. There is a lot of surprise or like amazement or shock when it comes to me in the gym, because in people's heads, they don't see it every day. They don't see a guy in a wheelchair jump on a weight and start lifting. I think it's more of a positive stigmas in terms of it's impressive, but then also that could be seen as a negative, because you're not doing anything that's like unique. It's just because you've got a disability, all of a sudden it becomes impressive. I take it as a positive, and if people have questions, I will happily answer them. Like, I've often had people come up to me and say like, oh wow, how did you get into training? Like, what, is there any things that you have to do differently? How have you figured these out, and what sort of inspired you to do it? And I'll happily sit there and have that discussion. So I don't think overall it's been negative perceptions. I think biggest challenge initially was overcoming the natural anxiety anyone has going into the gym. But if you add a disability into that mix, the anxiety is obviously heightened, because you're different to everyone else. Do I believe that enough government support is available for people with disabilities? This is a difficult question, because I do think that there are plenty of good schemes out there to support the disabled community. Do I think that more could be done in certain areas? I think there could be, particularly around employment. I think there's a huge stigma around disabled people getting into employment, and there needs to be work done to tackle this, because a lot of people can't get into work because of the misconceptions that employers have, or the challenges that actual employers have in terms of getting those disabled employees into a building or sort of meeting their requirement. I think the main issue around support for disabled people in regards to what support the government provide is more around awareness of the support that is available. I recently had an experience where I'm in the process of trying to self-fund a wheelchair. I'd had the consultation meeting with the sales guy, going through all the costs of what I thought I was going to have to foot completely myself. And then the sales guy informed me that I could apply for a grant through my work, which would allow me to get a certain proportion of the costs given to me by the government to support me with accessing my work. And I think these schemes need to be spoken about, and people need to be more aware of it, and the government needs to be more open with sharing this information. When you get a disability, no one gives you a handbook. Whereas I almost feel like the government needs to put something together for different age ranges. So this is the support available for children between the ages of 1 and 10. This is the support available for preparing for adulthood. This is the support available once you've left school. Just to give them a stepping stone on, okay, you have these struggles, but there is this support available, and it's just not advertised enough. Thank you for all your questions. If you do have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me at NQPC. If you just Google me, I come up everywhere, and just drop me a line and I'll be happy to answer any questions.